But what I fear is that during this fight against the progressive left, people will start to think their religious right is reasonable in comparison.
Oh no, the religious right. What, did Jerry Falwell suddenly rise from the grave? Did Pat Robertson wander out of the geriatric ward he's been in for the last 10 years?
They're both essentially two sides of the same authoritarian coin, so I thought I'd toss a few words that way.
Authoritarians? Okay, I can't wait to see the kind of crazy loon bags you've dug up from the depths of the internet. I bet it's some frothing evangelical who wants to make all women barefoot and pregnant.
So, let's talk about morality with Peter Kreeft.
What? Your example of an authoritarian, right-wing, religious person is Peter Kreeft? The guy who teaches philosophy at Boston College? This is the guy who's best known for writing dialogues between Socrates, Confucius, and Jesus? I really think we need to redefine what authoritarian means. Okay, so it looks like I'm going to have to respond to this video. And to be honest, I've been a fan of Vernaculis for about a year now. I think he typically does fairly good responses to things, but sometimes he's just dead wrong. Let's take a look at the Kreeft video that he seems to have a problem with.
I'm going to argue for the existence of God from the premise that moral good and evil really exist. They are not simply a matter of personal taste, not merely substitutes for I like and I don't like.
Okay, so obviously this concerns the moral argument for God. Now this is a very old argument. It goes back, well, vaguely to people like Aristotle and Plato, and more recently to thinkers in the Enlightenment like Kant. It's a very serious argument the philosophers have struggled with for a long time. And of course there have been atheist arguments against the moral argument. But modern atheists are really distinguished by the fact that they don't just seem to disagree with the argument, but they seem to be actually offended by this. And I think this goes back to Christopher Hitchens. Now, for most people who know and love Christopher Hitchens, he was a passionate moralist himself, and towards the end of his life, he had a career arguing against theists quite prominently. And this is one of the main arguments he came up against a lot. And he, in some sense, perfected the way that almost all atheists respond to the moral argument today, which is not to answer it, but to scoff at it, and to do what I like to call the Hitchens charade, which is to pose as a relativist when the moral argument is brought forward, and then later in the conversation to reassume moral objectivity when moral objectivity is needed to make a case. Of course, this is totally dishonest. The relativism is only assumed in order to refute the moral argument for God. The atheist, usually like Christopher Hitchens, is not a moral relativist and will do anything to actually avoid saying, I am a moral relativist. So you have this sort of two-step, where the atheist pretends like he's a relativist in order to scoff at the idea, and then backs up to position a moral objectivity as it's required. I want to see how Vernaculis handles this problem. Is he a moral relativist?
Well, I think that moral good and moral evil exist within my own framework. There are things that I find morally good and things that I find morally evil. If I find something morally evil, I 100% of the time don't like it. If I find something morally good, I 100% of the time do like it.
Okay, that sounds like moral relativism to me. I mean, all he's saying in that clip is morality is just what I happen to think is right or wrong, or what I feel is right or wrong. But, I mean, maybe it's more subtle than that. He does go on a little bit more.
So I suppose the framework would be this. Not liking something is necessary for you to find it morally evil, but not liking something does not necessitate it being a moral evil. There, I've made your case for you.
Now that's just logical hogwash unless you are a complete relativist. Vernaculis just basically said that if you like something, it couldn't possibly be a moral evil. I mean, it's relativism to me, but it seems like Vernaculis does have very definite opinions about some things that should be morally prioritized over others.
Which do I value more as a moral principle? Am I more anti-racist or pro-free speech? Obviously, I'm more pro-free speech.
Why? Why are you more free speech? I mean, 5 seconds ago you were proposing a completely relativist perspective, and now suddenly we're back to the place where we can pose one moral principle as objectively superior to another. I mean, he goes on about this, but I still don't understand the framework he's using to decide.
It's a very complex framework up here, but tends to work quite well for me.
All right, I mean, now I have no idea where you lie. One minute you claim to be a complete relativist, the morals you have are just your feelings. The next you're asserting that you can claim some moral positions are superior to others, and at the end of the day, it's purposefully vague. I mean, there's a reason right now that Vernaculis isn't just coming out and saying, morality is relative, it's all just your subjective opinion. And that's because he just wants the subjectivity in order to refute the argument, and he will make moral cases throughout this video. But let's see what Kreeft has to say.
Before I begin, let's get one misunderstanding out of the way. My argument does not mean that atheists can't be moral. Of course, atheists can behave morally, just as theists can behave immorally.
I'm so glad that Peter Kreeft made this clarification. This is one of two main confusions that's brought up when the moral argument is introduced. The first you just saw, which is the confusion that the moral argument is a case that atheists can't be moral. The second misrepresentation is that the claim that morality is objective is the same as the claim that morality must be set in stone and impossible to condition, and the same in every single circumstance. This is utterly ridiculous. It could be an objective moral fact that saving human life and preserving human life is a good thing, but at the same time, different rules might apply to that objective moral value in order to have it properly realized. Therefore, objective morality is not the same thing as saying that morality cannot be conditioned. But of course, I mean, who would make that argument, right?
That isn't the case. Morality depends on context and justification for action. For example, tossing out the line "don't kill" sounds fantastic. But what if someone is actively trying to kill you? Can you kill in self-defense? Now, most people, apart from complete pacifists, believe that if someone is currently trying to kill you, it is not immoral to kill them, unless you were trying to kill them to begin with. But that doesn't make pacifists factually incorrect.
And here is the confusion laid bare. There have been 2,000 years of moral realist philosophers, and not a single one of them, from Aristotle to Aquinas to Abelard, have ever made the case that objective morality implies that morality cannot have different expressions under different conditional circumstances. This is a complete straw man of an established philosophical argument.
There are also people who believe killing people is wrong, unless they're infidels and now killing them is allowed. But they are not factually inaccurate either. I think they're completely wrong, but not on a factual basis.
And now we're just getting more and more confused. I can tell by the way Vernaculis is using factual that he wants factual to only mean empirical facts. Now, every moral realist philosopher from Kreeft to Thomas Aquinas understands, or understood, that morality is not an empirical matter. But this is different than saying things cannot be objectively right or wrong. In fact, even the way that Vernaculis just said, well, they're still wrong, implies that he does think that some things can be wrong in an objective way.
Another problem with this argument are the people who think you simply can't take a hard stance on what you find to be moral or immoral because it's such a gray area. But I think that's wrong too. If that's the case, then no one would be able to take a hard stance on anything politically, on principles, or anything that isn't based in 100% fact.
Another misunderstanding. If we did indeed live in a morally relativistic universe, like Vernaculis implied in his opening, then we absolutely would not have the right to speak strongly about morals. And it's not just a matter of there being a gray area, right? It's not like we don't have the knowledge of some kind of moral absolute right or wrong. If it's a moral relativistic universe, there can't even be a gray area because there's no black and white pole to begin with. It's not a matter of information, it's just the fact that the question can't be coherently answered. Is this action or is this value objectively right or wrong?
When moral disagreements become factual disagreements, that's the day that things need an overhaul. And the day when moral disagreements never happen, we're either in a utopia or a dystopia, which are basically synonyms for one another, both of which are disgusting things I want no part in.
Of course, we left out another huge possibility. One way to have no moral disagreements is to have a worldview that does not allow for meaningful moral questions to be asked and answered. Why would I ever have a moral disagreement with somebody else if it was all just relative? I don't have disagreements over what kind of jelly beans people like or what kind of ice cream flavors they think are the most delicious, because those are all relative. In order to have a conversation, a disagreement, there has to be some right or wrong answer, or at least some way to change our minds and have that change be better or worse. Far from me to quote Pope Benedict XVI, but you can have a dictatorship of relativism.
Where do good and evil come from?
Us. I'm not even a neuroscientist, but before we existed, there was no concept of good and evil.
Okay, to be fair, this is sloppiness on the part of Kraft. I don't know how many people who are watching this have read Aristotle, but obviously Kraft meant where do morality come from in the sense of the ultimate cause, whereas Vernaculis is answering the question in the sense of the efficient cause. And the distinction is somewhat subtle. The efficient cause is what actually causes the object or things to be in the place they are right now, whereas the ultimate cause is the rational basis, the reason for things being the way they are. I could give an example in terms of math. Let's say I asked my friend, why do the square of two sides of a right triangle always equal to the square of the hypotenuse? And my friend answered, because of the Big Bang. Well, I guess in some sense, all triangles were created by the Big Bang, or all things that we see that are right triangles were created by them. But my question was a logical one. What creates the logical basis for that proposition to be true? And that's the sense that Kraft means it. Now, I know Vernaculis goes on not understanding this for about 5 minutes, so I'm just going to cut straight to Kraft's next argument.
Atheists typically propose a few possibilities. Among these are evolution, reason, conscience, human nature, and utilitarianism.
All of those things are specifics when discussing the brain. My answer was just the brain. If I had to pick which of one of these options to go with, I'd pick reason. The reason being because people decide on what they find to be moral and immoral and can actually change their minds throughout their lives regarding what is and isn't a moral action.
Okay, I really wish Vernaculis had thought about this for more than 5 minutes. But, just take this the next step. Why would you apply reason to something that's completely preferential? I don't sit down with some kind of notebook and try to figure out what color is my favorite color. I don't try to do logical deductions to try to figure out which possible pizza topping is the best one to put with anchovies. If it's a preference, then I don't need to actually apply a reason to it. If we apply a reason to morality, then we admit that morality is something much more like logic and much less like a preference in taste or color. Let's go back to Kraft and see what he has to say.
I will show you that none of these can be the ultimate source of morality. Why not from evolution? Because any supposed morality that is evolving can change. If it can change for the good or the bad, there must be a standard above these changes to judge them as good or bad.
It's still us. It is still us who are judging past actions. The moral standards we humans have today is what judges the moral standard we humans had centuries ago. It's not a higher standard, it's just other humans in the future looking into the past and pointing out what they think were awful, immoral mistakes.
All right, but that doesn't answer the question. The question is, can there actually be moral mistakes? If it's just a preference, then there cannot actually be moral mistakes. There can only be moral differences. This is the center point of the entire argument. I'll go back to logic. Heck, we can do that all day long, right? Presumably, a logical deduction, it's still just us doing it. It's still us just looking back at arguments and deciding that this deduction is right and this deduction is wrong. But at the same time, we still say that logical deductions can be objectively true or false. Now, at this point, I want to pause here and point out exactly what's going on in the course of this argument. Now, Vernaculis has again and again insinuated that morality is totally relative and just the subjective construction of the people who build it. But he hasn't actually explicitly said this, and that's because the argument relies on being very, very vague. There really is no way to have this middle ground where you can claim that morality is totally subjective and then still have conversations and have a reasonable application of logic to change people's minds. It doesn't work like that. If it's subjective, then there's no reason to ever change anybody's mind about a moral precept, because no movement of the mind from one moral precept to the other has any more value. And this is the conclusion that Vernaculis needs to avoid. So we have this constant flirtation with subjectivity, while at the same time implying that he has some basis for objective morality that's just too obvious to actually bring up explicitly.
The argument that atheists levy, and who knows, you may have encountered some of the stupid ones, is that humans evolved the capacity to fashion the concept of morality, not the individual precepts of what is and isn't moral, which is why I didn't pick evolution in your little drop-down list.
No, you picked reason, which implies that morality actually is subject to logic, which makes it a more objective feature than a subjective one.
I, for one, am very happy that people started questioning slavery. It's a good thing there weren't people out there claiming that slavery isn't objectively immoral, and so those questioners are wrong for eternity on a factual basis.
You seem to think that slaveholders were wrong for eternity on an objective basis, so I don't really see the point here. Anyway, let's let Kreeft go on about this analogy with slavery.
But based on a merely evolutionary model, that is, an ever-changing view of morality, who is to say that it won't be acceptable again one day?
No one. It might be. There's nothing preventing immoral ideas from becoming accepted as moral again. You just admitted that morality changes over time. But apparently it's only possible for morality to progress in one direction in the general consensus. No, it is entirely possible for immoral ideas to become accepted again. Look at the progressive left. Why do you think a lot of people call them regressive?
I mean, listen to the language here. It's possible for immoral ideas to become popular again. That's why we call them the regressive left. Every one of these statements implies that there is a moral standard that he's invoking. It's not just relativism. Otherwise, there would be no ability to say that an immoral idea has become popular or that people are regressing. It's an implicit direction that cannot be sustained on a relativist point of view.
Slavery was once accepted, but it was not therefore acceptable.
It was acceptable then. To them. It is not acceptable now. To us.
And if you can't make that distinction between accepted and acceptable, you can't criticize slavery.
Yes, you can criticize slavery, even if you don't make that distinction. Acceptable, as in generally considered moral, as in able to be accepted, is what you demonstrated when you brought up the slavery example. It used to be acceptable, and now it isn't. I can obviously make a distinction between whether I find something moral or immoral, or acceptable, as opposed to whether something is accepted on a widespread scale. For example, if you sent me back in time, during the times of slavery, I'd fight against it strongly and consider it to be not acceptable, but also recognize that it is generally accepted and acceptable in that time period.
So you basically can't distinguish between accepted and acceptable, can you, Vernaculis? You just demonstrated that, right? If it was acceptable in the 1800s to enslave people, if you went back in time to the 1700s, you could not make a moral case. What you're saying, in effect, is that, no, it actually was still wrong, even in the 1700s, and had you been transported back, you would have fought against it. But if the morality was different then, why would you? And now you see the sort of Hitchens two-step in action. One moment he's a moralist, the next moment he's a complete subjectivist. It goes back and forth as the argument requires, right? The next thing we know, he'll be claiming that morality is the same thing as liking different colors.
Stop this before you start thinking that the color most people like is necessarily the one that has to be your favorite.
And now we're back to relativism again. The Vernaculis that 5 minutes ago was claiming to stand athwart the rails of history and call down the regressives is now saying that preference in morality is the same thing as preference in color. It can go back and forth like this all day. Anyway, back to Kreeft.
If you can make that distinction, you are admitting to objective morality.
All you're admitting is that you personally may not find something moral that most other people do. Or if you're talking in the frame of time periods, that most people back then found something acceptable that most people don't find acceptable today.
Are we really going to go to this relativism thing again? I mean, do atheists really want to have the past be uncritiquable by our modern morality? I mean, Christopher Hitchens certainly didn't. He felt like he could call out the past all the time for being immoral. Not that that really gives you a basis for morality in the logical sense.
What about reasoning? While reasoning is a powerful tool to help us discover and understand morality, it cannot be the source of morality. For example, criminals use reasoning to plan a murder, without their reason telling them that murder is wrong.
This is a sloppy argument by Kreeft, and I'm not surprised if Vernaculis misunderstands it. What he's trying to say is that the basis for morality cannot be on pure reason alone, a case that Kant made.
Just because people commit murder, it does not necessitate that they don't think murder is wrong, first off. But they could be willingly participating in an immoral action that they think is actually immoral. But if someone can use reasoning to commit immoral actions, does this not mean that people can also use reasoning to commit moral ones?
Which makes the case that reason and morality are disconnected, that reason can't be the basis for morality.
And was it reasoning or something higher than reasoning that led those Gentiles who risked their life to save Jews during the Holocaust? The answer is obvious. It was something higher than reasoning. Because risking one's life to save a stranger was a very unreasonable thing to do.
Do you think that those people who saved their lives possibly used reasoning to do it, and their reasoning told them that it was the right thing to do, regardless of the harm that may come to them? No, of course not. The bad shit that people reason about is completely fine to blame on reason, but all of the good shit that people reason about, no credit is given to reason whatsoever, because doing good things for other people is unreasonable, and therefore not reason.
I really wish Vernaculis had thought about this for a little bit longer. If he really does believe that people can come to morality based on reason alone, let alone whether it's the basis for reason, which is a separate argument, then that would imply that morality does have some objective basis outside the human mind that can be reached beyond pure subjectivity. So what is the argument Vernaculis is making?
Nor can conscience alone be the source of morality. Every person has his own conscience, and some people apparently have none.
Allow me to examine your statement. You said, quote, "Every person has his own conscience," unquote. And that is your reason why conscience alone cannot be the source of morality. It sounds to me like you're begging the question, as if you assume that morality is objective already.
No, he's trying to force you into one consistent position. Is morality objective or subjective? You can't have it both ways. And this has been going on for 15 minutes, and it's still impossible to tell Vernaculis' opinion on this matter. Look, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but there's really nothing more to say on the matter. These little snippy arguments that he's inserting in between Kreeft's general points, they're ever so easy to make when you're arguing both A and not A. If you have both the arguments of an objective morality that's obviously accessible to everybody, and at the same time can assert that morality is subjective, well, then the world of comebacks is open to you, but there's really no coherent point here. I'm going to skip forward and see if at any point Vernaculis does answer this question. Is morality objective, or is it not objective and completely subjective? There really has to be an answer to that question.
How can you say your conscience is right and Himmler's is wrong if conscience alone is the source of morality? The answer is you can't.
The answer is because we have different views about what is and isn't moral. That's right, folks. Moral disagreements just don't exist. All of this arguing about what is and isn't moral is pointless. We've got a book, a god or a pseudo-philosopher that delivers what is and isn't moral from on high. We aren't allowed to make our own decisions because morals are facts, and if you have the wrong ones, then fuck you.
I mean, this sounds perfectly reasonable, but there isn't an argument here. I mean, if morality is completely subjective, that's not a case for having a moral argument. That's not a case for having a moral discussion. That's a case for never having a moral discussion. Because why on earth would you discuss things? Why on earth would you reason about things if the subject you're arguing about and reasoning about is totally subjective and just the construction of your particular preferences? If no one can be right, either you or Himmler or Hitler or Jesus or Buddha, if nobody can be right, why will there ever be a moral discussion? And that's the question that's never answered. And all the while, it amazes me how self-righteous people can be about not being morally self-righteous. I mean, you hear Vernaculis go on like this, you'd think he had some kind of pristine case to make, other than the fact that everyone just has their own opinion. Yet you see him expounding on it like he has some access to the truth. Come on, man, if everything is subjective, then there really is no strong case to be made whatsoever.
I think you're morally wrong. That is a strong enough statement.
No, that's a statement that can't possibly be made by a moral subjectivist.
You don't need to enshrine your morality in fact to make it a powerful argument. You can have arguments about values without referencing a single data point. Data points help, but they aren't necessary.
Why? Why do data points help? Why can you have an argument? Why can someone be right or wrong if everything is just people's opinions and conscience is completely subjective? Why?
You will never be able to prove your morality to be factually correct.
Well, leaving aside the fact that things do not necessarily need to be provable in order to be either true or false objectively, I can see Vernaculis is again going back to this factual point, as if morality were a factual empirical proposition. Something I established is a straw man.
And for some reason that scares the shit out of you. You don't want to have these arguments anymore. You just want to be able to dismiss any detractors in an easier way. Sorry, it says right here that you're morally wrong. No, it doesn't work that way. And I advocate that it never work like that. Everyone has the ability to unintentionally cause evil. I never want it to become an immoral action to criticize evil.
And now we're back to Vernaculis, the moral realist. After everything he said about conscience being subjective, about morality not being factual, about morality being something that is limited to something we construct, now he's talking about absolute evil. Now, I could go on again and again about how you need to have moral right and wrong answers to have a discussion. But I think I'm going to go for a different track entirely. Now, I actually, even as a theist, love Christopher Hitchens. I think he's a brilliant speaker. But I have one proposition for every atheist who might happen to listen to this. Go back to every one of Christopher Hitchens' essays, his books, and his discussions with theists. Go back to his discussion with Tariq Ramadan, his discussions with Islamists, and every time Christopher Hitchens calls out one of their immoral bullshit propositions and says, that is wrong, that is evil, why are you doing that? That is irrational, that is immoral. And replace him saying that with, I feel like you're wrong. Your argument hurts my feelings. That makes me feel uncomfortable. Just every time you have Hitchens make a strong moral case, replace that with just an allusion to his own personal feelings and see what that does to his writings. See what that does to the moral case he makes. It destroys Hitchens. Hitchens and the rest of the new atheists only even function if there's an objective morality to appeal to begin with. And you would think that the new atheists would understand this, because the old ones certainly did. You go back and look at people like Hume and Jefferson, and perhaps Jefferson wasn't a complete atheist, but they understood that you needed to have an objective morality in order to make these kind of humanist and liberal arguments. In order for the early Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment principles of freedom of speech and discussion and rationality to have a hold, there needs to be objectively right and wrong moral answers. Heck, even Nietzsche understood this. Nietzsche knew that you needed to have an objective morality that was somehow outside of our own subjectivity in order for these conversations to make sense. He didn't think there was one, but because of that, that caused him to become illiberal and nihilistic. But you cannot have this moral appeal of humanism without making a moral appeal to an objective case for a right and wrong.
What are moral laws?
Moral laws are the rules by which individual people decide to govern themselves on the matter of what is morally just and morally unjust. Oh, wait, sorry. I meant all the stuff the Bible says. That was the correct answer, wasn't it? This game show's easy as hell.
I don't think Peter Kreeft ever references the Bible throughout this entire argument, so I guess you lose this game show?
Unlike the laws of physics or the laws of mathematics, which tell us what is, the laws of morality tell us what ought to be.
What are the laws of morality?
I mean, I can give you a book by Jonathan Haidt if you're interested in common human moral systems. It might answer some questions.
But like physical laws, they direct and order something. And that something is right human behavior.
If they exist, I'd like one moral law, please. And I'd like to know where it comes from. I'd like to examine whether or not I think all of your moral laws are actually moral to me.
And now Vernaculis just pauses like he's made a point to something profound, but he hasn't really said anything. I mean, people may notice that I have cut up Vernaculis a lot when I'm making this response video, but a lot of what I did was just cut out the constant, snide, condescending remarks that constantly pepper this entire argument. And once you do that and actually lay the argument bare, you see how fundamentally contradictory it is. How every single time it just oscillates between relativism and total moral realism. There's no case here. Anyway, it's getting totally redundant, so I'm skipping ahead to Kreeft's main last argument.
The very existence of morality proves the existence of something beyond nature and beyond man.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
Just as a design suggests a designer, moral commands suggest a moral commander. Moral laws must come from a moral lawgiver. Well, that sounds pretty much like what we know as God.
That's right, everyone. It doesn't matter what these moral laws are, or whether you find them moral or immoral. God defines morality for you. Checkmate, atheists!
Well, that's not exactly the argument, but it works as a ridiculous straw man.
Am I going crazy, or is this just rambling lunacy?
It's a 2,000-year-old philosophical argument that many modern philosophers, who are much smarter than me or you, take very seriously. But I understand if you want to just portray it like a crazy thought that Peter Kreeft had one day.
So the consequence of this argument is that whenever you appeal to morality, you are appealing to God, whether you know it or not. You're talking about something religious, even if you think you're an atheist.
I think one of God's moral laws is immoral. Oh, sorry, that doesn't make sense, because God is morality and I'm factually incorrect. How fucking convenient. Figure that one out.
I think I'm going to have a hard enough time figuring out what your argument is without you tossing in Euthyphro's dilemma at the last moment. Seriously. There were 3 ways that Vernaculis could have actually put forward a specific argument against the moral case for God. He could have said, I'm a complete relativist. There's no such thing as objective morality. It's all completely constructed. It's all completely subjective. He could have said, I believe in objective morality, but I just don't think that we need to have a God in order to justify it. Or, hypothetically, he could have said, well, I believe in objective morality, and maybe there is some sort of deistic God, but I just don't believe that that means that God has to have the properties of the Christian God, or necessarily that morality has to have the properties of the Christian morality. Any 3 of those arguments would have been totally legitimate arguments to bring against the moral argument for God. But Vernaculis doesn't commit to any one of those. Instead, he plays back and forth. Is there objective morality? Maybe. There isn't. There is. Is it subjective? And it's a complete train wreck. And all the while, there's this ridiculous argument, this utterly ridiculous argument that if we are not moral subjectivists, then we cannot have rational discussions about what morality is or what the right course of action is, when the exact opposite is the case. Now, I don't know if any atheist stuck through all 30 minutes of this after action report, but let me just make an appeal to you in these last few moments. You have to believe in objective moral right and wrongs, regardless of whether you believe in God, in order to have a rational conversation about the rights and wrongs of a moral issue. And I mean, you can take my word for that. You can believe me or you cannot believe me. But let's just think back about the history of the new atheist movement in the last 10 years. And let's look at the career of Christopher Hitchens, who I admire very much, even though I do not share his atheism. In 2007 and 2008, Christopher Hitchens came to America with the intent of debating theists, and he was able to go from one side of this country to another, and everywhere he went and challenged Christians to a debate, they rose and met him, even though, in most of the cases, he lashed them mercilessly because he was a much better speaker and a much more educated person. They still came and discussed because they believed in the productivity of having moral conversations and having debates. Now fast forward to 2016. Think of your opponents now, the regressive left, the social justice warriors, the people who are the subject of Vernaculis' channel on a regular basis. How hard is it to get them into a debate? They never debate. They never meet their opponent's arguments. They never respond. And why is that? Because they're all moral relativists. They do not believe in the moral necessity of having discussion. They do not believe that a discussion on morality can even be productive, because at the end of the day, they only believe in subjective feeling and nothing beyond that. Why would a subjectivist ever have a debate with another subjectivist? And that's the situation you find yourself in. The Christian would always debate. He would always be ready for a moral discussion, because as a moral realist, he understands the utility of that. But to a social justice warrior subjectivist, that's the utility that they'll never understand. An objective morality is necessary for a rational conversation about ethics. And that is true regardless of whether there is a God or if there is not. And that's all there is to say on the matter. Have a great night.